So I want to share my thoughts on what I consider to be one of the greatest films of all time, which is Idiocracy, directed by Mike Judge, the creator of Beavis and Butthead and King of the Hill. It's a science fiction comedy in which the premise is in modern society, with no natural predators to thin the herd, evolution began to favor the people who reproduced the most, and the idiots outnumbered the intelligent people. A military librarian, Joe Bowers, I don't want to spoil the film too much, but give some of the most important insights from it. He undergoes this cryogenic military experiment. They try to determine whether or not a human body can be stored indefinitely, time travel in a sense. The facility was closed down essentially. The experiment proved to be a success, but the main protagonist woke up in a very bleak and disturbing future in which society was comprised of very unintelligent, rash, unproductive ne'er-do-wells, essentially. The prominent culture was like a combination, like a mishmash of the worst aspects of inner city ghetto culture, hillbilly culture, machismo culture. The infrastructure was in shambles. There was mountains of garbage. Agriculture practically ceased to exist because crops were being watered with sports drinks.
A little discrepancy in the film is how people manage to continue living without agriculture. But the film is primarily concerned with imbuing a message rather than, little technicalities.
People had practically everything at their disposal, right? Highly palatable processed food, fast food, highly stimulating, extravagant, violent, and sexual imagery, immediate gratification, which forewent persistence and effort to achieve something, like undertaking the effort to compose a brilliant piece of music. Mindfulness meditation in and of itself, the experience of sitting in silence, can be unbearable too. And so this made people otherwise lazy, imperceptive, absent-minded, concerned primarily with the pursuit of pleasure, but a false sense of pleasure, a stifling form of pleasure that stunted humanity. And to add insult to injury, children were being fed sports drinks instead of breast milk, which destroyed their brains from the get-go. We must operate on this presupposition that engaging with modern conveniences necessarily makes us all stupid. I mean, we don't live in a state of hunting and gathering anymore. And there's various means of exercising our intelligence. Deciding to read extensively, engage in discourse and dialogue with people, physical exercise, even if we ourselves sometimes succumb to addictive tendencies. IQ in and of itself, it's important, but even high IQ people can be prone to that emotional volatility. Obviously, there's people who have high IQs who can exhibit cruelty, and oftentimes that cruelty can be more calculated than like a rash, stereotypical low IQ person. For it was a lot of people with high IQs, entrepreneurs, for instance, who established social media platforms and deeply understood human behavior, who sought to exploit it. Now, I'm not placing a value judgment on social media. I believe people ought to assume responsibility for how they use modern conveniences, but being bombarded with immediate gratification can make that process more difficult. But I understand, it's not so much about IQ, but this general idea of what it means to be stupid, right? Somebody who's controlled by their desires, prioritizes sensual pleasures over intellectual endeavors, and senselessly follows the crowd. Compare and contrast, the bulk of human history was spent in a state of hunting and gathering, right? Tribes people had to put a lot of effort into maintaining survival, right? They couldn't just order Taco Bell or Burger King on their phone. Addictions, be it adult material, be it drugs and alcohol, so on and so forth, it desensitizes the dopamine receptors in your brain to where you require more to derive some semblance of pleasure, but it's often more the anticipation of the pleasure than the reward, in quotations, that you get. And almost like this inability to deliberate a choice as to whether they should engage or not. In this film, that conscience was largely absent. One of the most iconic scenes to me was the main female protagonist got through a security checkpoint by telling the security guard there was a naked woman outside, and he completely just abandoned his job to get that sexual pleasure. I don't know how many people remember Omegle, but Omegle is notorious for having just a massive amount of people just burping the worm indiscriminately, not control their desires, right? Or maybe they even have some sense of self awareness, they just don't care. Some people argue that the film Idiocracy is prophetic in some sense. These absurd, satirical sort of displays. There's a scene where, like, the protagonist escapes a car, and then law enforcement with machine guns just shoots the car until it explodes, and there's mobs of people cheering on the violence, right? Something akin to like a Roman Colosseum of people reveling in senseless violence. And it reminds me of some scenes I saw during riots here in the United States of people jumping on top of police cars and dancing and like twerking after burning things ablaze. There's also the scene when President Camacho is reading the script to his audience, and which we saw in recent times with the former president. People are going to have their own interpretations that Idiocracy represents this or that political party, so on and so forth. But the underlining themes are largely relevant to all of humanity. But I'm not going to spoil the rest of the film. I just wanted to give you the gist of it.
Overall, it's one of my favorite films. Some could see it as exaggerated in some aspects. I mean, there's certainly like a various interplay of factors that would create such a dystopian society to begin with. And, some people can have elements of themselves that are representative of that idiocracy, for instance. Like, there's some very quote unquote intelligent people who suffer from those types of addictions where they actually can become kind of stupid in that moment. My college experience was somewhat reminiscent of Idiocracy. In my dormitory, there was a lot of people my age who were extremely rash and inconsiderate, and sidestepped the boundaries of people who didn't want to be exposed to like drinking and drugs and so on and so forth when it came at their expense, and being very provocative and loud and rowdy and tribalistic, basically, like grouping together and picking fights with certain people. Some of those people grow up, but you kind of see similar behavior in the realms of politics. I'll never forget this meeting in which the RA congregated all of us in the dormitory to get to speak and interact and whatnot. And we played a game with a questionnaire, one of which was, what's something you did today that you're proud of? This one gentleman slouched backwards confidently. Well, I took a massive dump earlier, right? And it inspired like this Beavis and Butthead-esque laughter amongst the group, right? And he described this gentleman described himself as a philosopher. And I'm not necessarily trying to like argue against having fun and whatnot, being silly and goofy, but there really are a lot of people who very seldom think of anything deeper than fart jokes. So, but again, this is kind of just capturing like a cultural phenomenon and magnifying it to a grand scale.